They handed him your name like a loaded gun and told him to pull the trigger before you got too dangerous. The transaction was clean, the narrative rehearsed. He's fragile. Watch the eyes. He flinches when you mention the past. What they didn't understand is that the version they sold him hadn't existed for years. You had already died once. Publicly, privately, painfully. And what rose from those ashes had no need to prove survival. So when he came for you, expecting panic and pliability, what he found instead was stillness. Not cowardice, stillness. The kind that comes from someone who has already fought the ugliest battle, inward, and doesn't fear any external war. He expected to confront a human being. What he met was something else. A presence built in silence, shaped by betrayal, reinforced by solitude. He came with intent. But intent dies in the face of someone who no longer needs to react. He studied your posture, calculated the effect of his words. Nothing landed. Not because you didn't feel it, but because you'd already outgrown it. He was trained to provoke. You were trained to withstand. And that difference shattered him. Because control only works on those still tied to outcomes. But you had detached. Not in bitterness, but in finality. There was no crack to exploit. No wound to reopen. You were sealed. Tempered. What broke him wasn't your strength. It was your peace. He didn't walk away defeated. He walked away disturbed, because something in you mirrored what he didn't want to face in himself. The absence of fear. The absence of need. You weren't fighting for validation. You were moving from alignment. You didn't want to be liked. You wanted to remain clean. And that unsettled him. He had been paid to destroy a man, not to meet a mirror. But that's exactly what happened. In the way you breathed. In the way you refused to flinch. He saw every lie he'd told himself about power, about identity, about what it means to be unbreakable. You didn't defend yourself. You didn't explain. You allowed him to collapse under the weight of your restraint. The plan was to catch you emotionally naked, corner you, make you unravel. What they didn't anticipate was the level of awareness you now carried, awareness that turned ambush into art. You didn't resist, you redirected, not with cleverness but with clarity. You saw through the performance, and because you didn't try to win, you never lost. You simply remained, unmoved. That's what crushed him. His entire arsenal was designed for reaction, but you gave him none. That's when he realized he wasn't there to destroy you. He was sent to discover what couldn't be destroyed. And once he saw it, he knew he would never be the same. You were not a target. You were a test. A test they failed before they even launched the attack. Because in trying to end you, they revealed their dependence on your demise. That's the irony. They needed your fall more than you ever needed their support. They fed him stories, tried to shape his perception. But perception has no power over presence. And your presence made him doubt their entire narrative. He came with conviction. He left with confusion. Because something in your stillness whispered, I already forgave this moment before it arrived. And that kind of grace, the type that doesn't seek revenge, just resolution, left him haunted. He couldn't carry out the mission because the mission didn't survive your reality. What was theory in their minds crumbled in front of your execution. They paid for collapse. What they received was reflection. He wasn't met with force. He was met with dignity, and it rattled his core. Because deep down, he knew he would have broken under what you'd endured. He realized that someone who survives betrayal without becoming bitter is a different species. That's what shook him. Not your defense, but your design. You were not built for comfort. You were forged for truth. And truth doesn't beg to be understood. He saw your scars, and they weren't wounds, they were architecture. Evidence of reconstruction. He thought pain would make you weak, but pain had made you precise, focused. You didn't dodge his energy. You absorbed it, let it dissolve, and handed it back to him unweaponized. He had no category for that kind of power. Power that doesn't destroy but disarms. Power that doesn't seek domination but offers liberation. In that moment, you taught him more about strength than 1,000 victories ever could. You didn't need to win him over. He realized he was never your enemy. He was just a messenger who misunderstood the message. They paid him in currency. You paid him in clarity. A clarity so piercing that it shattered the story he'd built around what it means to be strong. He couldn't complete the task, not because you overpowered him, but because you unraveled the illusion he'd been living in. He came to end you. He ended up shedding a version of himself instead. And when he returned to them, silent and shaken, they panicked. Because silence is dangerous when it comes from someone who used to be loyal to noise. You broke him without lifting a hand. That was the move. That was the masterpiece. They thought they were clever, sending someone to do what they couldn't, because they were too emotionally entangled to see you clearly. But in outsourcing their venom, they sent him into a fire they weren't prepared to acknowledge. You didn't scorch him. You illuminated him. And now they sit in their shadows, trying to process why their plan failed. Why their assassin came back with eyes that no longer see you as prey. They lost him, and they lost the narrative. Because you didn't just survive, you transmuted, from victim to vision, from hunted to holy. They tried to orchestrate your end, but what they created was a witness. They thought your silence meant confusion, that you were searching for the right words to win them back. But you weren't silent because you were lost. You were silent because you were done. You reached the point where the urge to be understood disintegrated under the weight of your self-respect. And that shift, subtle, unannounced, changed everything. You no longer needed to correct their version of you. You no longer played defense in a game rigged for distortion. You simply exited the stage and let their assumptions echo in an empty theater. They didn't panic at first. They called it pride, called it bitterness. But over time, something darker settled in their bones. The realization that you were gone from their ecosystem. Not in body, in relevance. Explaining yourself had always been a negotiation, a surrender, a bridge you kept rebuilding every time they burned it, hoping they'd meet you halfway. But clarity is exhausting when it's wasted on minds committed to misunderstanding. You grew tired of handing over your peace just to feed their comfort. And when you finally refused, when you simply stared through their accusations without flinching, they began to unravel. Because people who survive on control require explanation to hold the illusion together. You starved that illusion, and in that void, they saw what they never anticipated. Your detachment wasn't a tactic. It was liberation. They kept trying to provoke a monologue, kept prodding you for reactions. But the version of you that needed to be seen, to be justified, to be right, had already been buried. You stopped bleeding explanations, and in that stillness, you became a paradox they couldn't manipulate. You weren't angry, you weren't fragile, you were untouchable. Because once a person stops explaining themselves, they stop playing roles. And once the roles dissolve, so does the control others once had over their identity. You became a blank page to them, and people fear what they can't annotate. They misread your silence as surrender because they still thought of you as someone who sought resolution. But you outgrew resolution. You found truth, and truth doesn't need consensus. It doesn't need applause. It sits in the center of your chest, heavy and eternal. And once you met that kind of truth, the kind that isn't swayed by tone or guilt, or the threat of abandonment, you stopped writing footnotes for people unwilling to read the whole story. You let them misunderstand. You let them talk. And that act of letting go became your most violent rebellion. Because you didn't just reclaim your narrative, you stopped needing one. You became dangerous the moment you stopped reacting. Not because you had something to hide, but because you had nothing left to prove. That's when they realized their strategies were outdated. The guilt trips, the passive jabs, the performative apologies, all of it bounced off a mind no longer tethered to outcome. They were swinging at a ghost. You didn't argue. You didn't protest. You simply let them sink into the void they created while trying to pull you down. And in that quiet resistance, you became the thing they feared most. Independent of their approval, impervious to their design, their control relied on access, emotional access, intellectual access. Access to your patterns, your fears, your need for validation. But you rewrote the locks, you removed the hinges. You no longer invited them into your processing. You smiled when they expected rage. You walked away when they expected you to chase. And every time they met a silence that didn't plead, they felt the power shift. Because now you weren't just surviving them, you were rendering them obsolete. That kind of emotional evolution can't be reversed. It can't be negotiated. It's final. They tried to argue with your absence, tried to reconstruct the narrative by calling you cold, distant, ego-driven. But what they really feared was the heat of your clarity. You saw too much, not in others, in yourself. And when you finally sat with your own reflection long enough to stop seeking mirrors in people, you became ungovernable. Their games couldn't land anymore because you'd already seen the cost of playing. And now, the silence you carry into rooms doesn't beg for peace. It commands it. The moment you stopped explaining, you stopped inviting manipulation. You cut off the fuel supply. You didn't block them with malice. You didn't ghost them with arrogance. You simply stopped translating your worth into words small enough for them to swallow. You left their table without slamming the chair, and that calm exit did what no outburst ever could. It exposed the imbalance. It revealed that the only reason you ever had to explain yourself was because they needed you confused to maintain superiority. Now, they sit with a version of you that doesn't flinch, doesn't plead, doesn't shrink. They used to study your tone, read between your pauses, twist your confessions into ammunition. But now you give them nothing. Not because you're hiding, but because you're healed. Your silence is not a fortress, it's a garden. One they don't have keys to anymore. And they can't stand that. Because the most terrifying thing you ever did wasn't threaten, wasn't cry, wasn't scream. It was walk away with a truth too large to speak and too firm to argue. You stopped needing them to hear it. You stopped needing them to deserve it. They craved a scene. They needed it. Your voice cracking, your breath uneven, your words spilling in a desperate attempt to correct the narrative. That was the currency they traded in emotional leakage. They weren't seeking truth. They were scavengers in search of spectacle. Every pause from you was a problem they thought they could solve with pressure. They prodded. Mentioned names they knew would sting. Brought up wounds with surgical precision. Twisted silence into implication. They weren't communicating. They were poking at scabs, hoping to reopen the wound. Because a bleeding version of you was easier to understand. Predictable. Softened. But you didn't perform. You didn't take the bait. You let their words fall flat like dull knives against armor forged in solitude. And when there was no monologue, when you gave them nothing but still eyes and a closed mouth, their desperation began to show. They had rehearsed this moment. They imagined your breakdown, your over-explanation, your trembling voice trying to fit your vastness into their narrow expectations. They were ready to weaponize every word you spoke, twist your pain into confession, but you offered no such gift. You stayed still, and that stillness became a mirror, one they didn't want to look into, because it reflected not who you are, but who they still are, petty, insecure, dependent on reaction to feel significant. Your silence forced them to face the fact that you no longer needed their understanding to feel whole. You had transcended their theater, and now their stage looked childish in comparison to the empire you had built within yourself. Every sigh you withheld was a statement. Every reply you denied was an act of rebellion. You weren't being dismissive. You were being deliberate. You chose not to speak, not because you had nothing to say, but because they didn't deserve access to your truth anymore. You had spent years being generous with your clarity, handing out explanations like candy to people who never listened, just waited for their turn to speak. That generosity died the moment you realized they weren't confused. They were comfortable in misrepresenting you. So you cut the cord. You gave them nothing. And they mistook it for arrogance, when it was actually discipline. They called it passive. They called it cold. But the truth is, they were never strong enough to handle your clarity. They wanted your words only so they could rearrange them. Their memory was selective, their intent corrupted. They weren't seeking dialogue. They were fishing for a way to spin your honesty into chaos. They needed you emotional, because that's when you were pliable. But you had outgrown that vulnerability. You didn't shut down, you evolved. And in that evolution, your silence became terrifying. Because it meant you were no longer trying to be chosen. You had already chosen yourself. They wanted to pull you back into the old rhythm. You speak, they spin. You hurt, they highlight. You confess, they capitalize. But your refusal to play the part made the game unbearable. They ran out of script, ran out of tactics. And that's when you saw it, the flicker of panic behind their smugness. The fear that you had outgrown the entire stage. That you didn't need to defend your name, because you were building a legacy far beyond the reach of gossip. Their manipulation relied on your insecurity. And when you no longer needed to be understood by them, their power dissolved. They had become addicted to the sound of your defensiveness. It gave them a sense of control, a sense of importance. But silence has a strange way of stripping people bare. When you stop explaining, they are left with their own reflections. They hear their own voice too clearly. Their arguments become echoes. Their accusations boomerang back without a target. And it drives them mad. Because without your reaction, their chaos has no fuel. They become a storm chasing a sky that refuses to thunder, and you become untouchable. Not because you're hiding, but because you've already weathered worse within. They tested boundaries that no longer existed. They said things to provoke the old you, the one who'd bend, who'd cry, who'd try to make peace with people who celebrated your ruin in secret. But that version was gone. You let them talk, let them speculate, let them drown in their own monologue, searching your face for any flicker of emotional availability. And when they found nothing, no tremble, no tension, no crack, they felt it, the brutal weight of being irrelevant. Because silence, when held with dignity, is the loudest form of power. You didn't give them silence to be mysterious. You gave them silence because anything you said would have been wasted on minds that love the sound of their own projections. You understood the psychology of provocation. They weren't speaking to connect. They were speaking to dominate, to bait, to narrate your story with their voice. But you took back that voice, not with a louder one, but with absence. A clean, unflinching absence. And they couldn't recover from that.